Karl Marx, the feared philosopher with imposing beards and theories that shook the world, doesn't usually sound like someone linked to children's literature. However, behind his torrent of economic and political writings lies a detail as unexpected as it is fascinating. Did you know that Marx had a direct connection with stories intended for children, tales that some scholars link to his own family environment? His name, associated with workers' struggles and revolutions, appears in academic conversations alongside seemingly innocent stories that sought to educate and entertain 19th-century children. This blending of the father of communism and the innocence of childhood creates an image as strange as it is intriguing, almost as if a writer of military treatises ended up writing fables to lull his grandchildren to sleep. The curious detail emerges within Marx's inner circle. His daughter, Eleanor Marx, passionate about theater and translation, became one of the main driving forces behind ensuring her father's ideas transcended dense texts and reached unexpected audiences. Eleanor never hesitated to bring stories, plays, and tales to children, using them as vehicles for reflection on society. And although Karl himself did not directly write stories for children, his influence seeped into the narratives shared at home, like a secret echo of great struggles contrasting with the sweetness of the child's world. It is striking to think that a theorist who described the contradictions of capitalism could coexist with the fantasy of characters and morals aimed at shaping young minds' first visions of the world. But the most striking link is not so much in what Marx wrote, but in what surrounded him. His circle of friends included authors who explored popular tales and accessible literature. He had intellectual ties with figures who studied European folklore, the same that nourished the stories collected by the Brothers Grimm. It's impossible not to imagine the Prussian thinker, immersed in calculations and critiques of capital, also surrounded by a world where folk tales conveyed morals about justice, punishment for greed, or rewards for solidarity. Could it be a coincidence that popular storytelling shared values that resonated with his critical view of society? This is where the hypothesis begins to take shape that traditional tales functioned as an unexpected bridge to his ideas. Eleanor, known in London as an activist and feminist pioneer, translated and shared plays and stories. She was also a great admirer of Henrik Ibsen, whose female characters broke with social norms. This influence seeped into households of the era, and the stories acquired a political and social undertone disguised as fables or morals. For Marx, hearing his daughter breathe life into characters in stories and plays was a reminder that social change did not always rise from the barricades, but also from the child's imagination. That intersection of discourses turns a family gathering into a transcendental moment where the universe of children merged with the seed of revolutionary critique, like a sort of parallel tale growing in the shadow of his theories. One of the most curious aspects is how in many folk tales greed, exploitation, and abuse of power appear as inevitable villains, and it's almost impossible not to relate these narrative structures to Marx's symbolic language, which in his writings denounced precisely the oppression and selfishness of dominant classes. Deceived peasants, unjust kings, poor children who survive through cunning. These are not only the protagonists of stories, they also seem like metaphors for the struggle against capital. The coincidence suggests that, although he did not write children's tales himself, Marx's parallel universe and children's storytelling ended up brushing against one another, like two rivers that run apart but carry the same undercurrent beneath the surface. In Marx's correspondence, we find traces of tenderness toward his own children. Behind the stern face and heavy critiques of political economy, he was also a father who invented small stories to entertain them, something that deeply humanizes his figure. His daughters recounted episodes where he improvised tales full of imagination at night. It might seem like a trivial detail, but when these family episodes are compared with the classic stories of the time, a strange symbiosis can be noticed. A radical thinker capable of improvised little tales where children were protagonists of adventures, while in his texts he denounced the real adventures of capitalists and workers locked in perpetual conflict. What is truly striking is the contrast. Imagine Karl Marx, with his pen destined to draft pages calculating surplus value, inventing a bedtime story for his little ones. On the same desk, economic categories and imaginary princesses coexisted, and although those household stories were never published, they nourished a hidden side. The cultural influence of Marx in the construction of storytelling beyond politics. The ideas that would later resonate with generations of workers were also present in a father feeding his children's minds with the sweetness and mystery of narrative. For a moment, the revolutionary became a narrator of family dreams, creating a balance that was never foreseen in intellectual history. This lesser-known side of Marx intertwines with another key figure, Wilhelm Liebknecht, close collaborator and influential political figure. Liebknecht recounted that, during family moments, Marx dedicated time to games and fables with his daughters. The improvised stories were not ideological speeches, but inevitably bore the shades of his worldview. It was no accident that in those tales the protagonists challenged injustice or sought collective solutions. The amusing part was that those who heard Marx in his political circles never expected this tender side. The contrast heightened his magnetism. A theoretical colossus who, come evening, invented a children's universe of words and adventures for the little voices surrounding him. In this fascinating intersection, we must note that 19th-century children's literature was not pure innocence. Many stories were full of raw endings, harsh morals, and relentless punishments. We are not speaking of a Disney world, but of tales where wolves devour, witches punish, and misery is portrayed with starkness. In that context, Marx's vision found fertile ground, because those stories reproduced the same inequities he denounced in his magnum opus. Children received stories that showed the harshness of the world, and Marx, in analyzing exploitation and injustice, seemed to speak the same language as those fables that rigorously educated European childhood of the era. The paradox is delightful. The same bourgeois society Marx so harshly criticized fed its children stories that depicted misery and inequality. The cultural breeding ground carried echoes of rebellion on every children's page, and although Marx did not personally write them, these tales could act as a first pedagogy of social contradiction. Children absorbed the message that greed was dangerous, that collective strength was salvific, and that abuse of power always met with punishment. Thus, unintentionally, the stories meant to entertain children became an unexpected terrain where social critique coexisted in a symbolic form very similar to the foundations Marx analyzed in his theoretical production. Another curious detail appears in the Marx family's connection with theatrical interpretations. Eleanor and her sisters took part in home performances where they adapted stories or invented small plays. In these dramatizations, childhood play intertwined with discourses of emancipation. Marx's household was a theatrical microcosm where stories served as raw material to rehearse roles that questioned norms and injustices. Imagine improvised actors in the living room, turned into poor peasant women who rebel or magical characters who resist tyrants. It all functioned as a symbolic laboratory where childhood and politics collided, creating a hybrid that no conventional history book could precisely describe. But that adds a surprising layer to Marx's figure. The charm of this story lies in its paradox. the philosopher of class struggle creating a family space where children's fiction coexisted with discussions of political economy. His improvised stories and his daughter's approach to dramatic literature reveal a forgotten side, the human Marx who, without abandoning his revolutionary facet, allowed imagination to bloom at home. This hybrid space shows how children's culture and social theory were not so distant. On the contrary, the reality of the weakest and popular morals connected perfectly with history's great dilemmas. The result? A multidimensional Marx, far from the caricature of the stern intellectual who became a teller of unexpected stories. One might say Marx never wrote a children's story in the strict sense, but he left a legacy intertwining his thought with the world of childhood. His daughters inherited both his ideas and his ability to tell stories, and projected it into their own cultural militancy. What's interesting is that the impact of this side still surprises us today. Every time we speak of classic tales about justice, poverty, or ambition, an invisible bridge can be drawn to the critiques Marx launched more than 150 years ago. It is as if stories and theories were connected by an invisible thread that still vibrates. That vibration is what causes wonder and keeps us attentive. Politics and childhood dialoguing in ways we could never have imagined. Suddenly, the image of the philosopher among papers and manuscripts shifts. He is no longer only the man who devised abstract concepts and dense documents. He is also the one who improvised surprising stories in an armchair, surrounded by his expectant daughters. It is in those moments that the barrier between ideology and tenderness dissolves, between class struggle and magical characters who survive impossible trials. If we think about it, Marx's influence on childhood goes far beyond isolated stories. It is proof of how a figure born to transform world thought also participated, indirectly, in the cultural fabric that fuels children's imagination. And that is, perhaps, the most powerful irony of all.